Hi, it's Jay again. The problem of scale, despite the research paper on Sunday and the comorbidity of starting the summer second semester course, despite not being finished with this one, was still really interesting and got me thinking. At the heart of it seems to be this conflict between two opposing and contrary forces, one of liberty and representative government, and one more towards centralization, bureaucracy, and the reduction of the citizen, the individual, to an almost atomic level. Suk-Woo Kim and Mark T. Law have found that over-centralization can lead to urban areas growing in size and power at the expense of local government, generally in small, limited numbers of cities that dominate the countryside. One is reminded of the Paris that Edmund Burke railed against in the new organization of France during the French Revolution with its cantons, communes, but with Paris dominant. Conversely, a study by Baffa, Piolata, and Ponzetto argued that decentralization could impact accountability, citing research that suggests smaller government is more prone to mismanagement and corruption. They detail the embarrassing history of corruption in city and state governments throughout the United States. My own local metropolis enjoyed a continuous FBI presence in the 1990s, with many local government department heads ending up in federal prison, including the housing authority head, who was found to have emptied the change out of the washers and dryers and to have buried them in glass jars for, I guess, retirement. They pointed to the cleaning out of political machines by the New Deal. The pull to centralization is a strong one. Just want to mention, trying to improve the sound quality. I apologize if I do appear to be somewhat of an air traffic controller, and we are experiencing thunderstorms, so you may see some flashes of lightning. Unrelated to anything I'm doing here, I promise. Speaking of promises, larger size is supposed to be for greater shared resources, the sum greater than individual parts, able to take advantage of the economies of scale. However, all of that has to be managed, and it's usually managed with bureaucracy. And with all due respect to Otto von Bismarck, that does little to promote efficiency or effectiveness. Dr. Don Livingston in his videos made compelling cases that the Roman Empire was too large to rule by democracy. Rome is an example of what happens when a state grows too large and can collapse into empire and then tyranny. He pointed more to the example of Athens at 300,000 people as an exemplary city with arts, sciences, security, economic excellence, and culture. It was no match for Rome, but its inherent greatness allowed it to succeed afterward as an independent study. There is the challenge. How do we maintain a dynamic society that is able to be responsive to the needs of the area, as opposed to providing each with that same block of government surplus cheese, whether the problems faced are hunger, disease, crime, unemployment, or any of the other legion of challenges communities face? The claims of economies of scale are fine until one has to drive 6 hours to the hospital for the emergency room and wait in line. And I think we're all wary these days of large-scale government being capable of doing any function in an inexpensive way. I'm reminded of the last season of Downton Abbey when they faced forced incorporation into a regional hospital system. And there was an amazing speech by the Dowager Countess Violet on the idea of, and the ideal of, local decision-making and resources in the face of the drumbeat of centralization in its absolutist tendencies. For years, I've watched government take control of our lives, and their argument is always the same: fewer costs, greater efficiency, but the result is the same too: less control for the people, more control by the state, until the individual's own wishes count for nothing. That is what I consider my duty to resist. Your great-grandchildren won't thank you when the state is all-powerful because we didn't fight. Quoting the Dowager, not me. She even referenced Magna Carta and the barons who insisted the king respect and recognize their rights. Now, I only watch the show when I'm on my elliptical and not watching Dr. Donald Livingston or Daniel Hannan, so I don't actually know how it turned out for them. Please, no spoilers in the responses. However, according to Common Magazine's online, they did a poll, And a Gallup poll in 1944 found 71% of former patients favored a state system. However, by the new millennium, a headline in The Guardian proclaimed, NHS must end mass centralization, says new boss. The idea of maintaining the same number of elected officials in a representative body despite changes in population really impacted me. All I could think of was the analogy to money. If the central bank maintains the same amount of gold, because why would anyone go off the gold standard permanently for a scheme of flow to fiat currencies? Sorry. If the central bank maintains the same amount of gold, yet continues to print new dollars, each dollar printed makes the dollars worth less. Similarly, if the population continues to grow, but the same number of representatives are elected, the value of each citizen is diminished proportionally. With the number of senators and representatives in the United States capped, as we learned in the video, in 1929 at 435, that means that for every youth reaching 18 years of age and every new citizen immigrating to this country and able to vote, their vote is worth comparatively less. Some in California and other states of a more progressive nature have argued they should have more electoral votes, more senators, more representatives than those with smaller population, as in having more citizens, they feel they should be more and better proportionally represented. Not the ideal situation I'm looking for, but I also think of the District of Columbia, which has 3 electoral votes, but no representation in Congress. And I think how they might appreciate the founders' response to being told all of Parliament represents them, or in this case, Congress. And then I was struck by a chilling thought. How many citizens does the EU or European Union purport to represent? Even with Brexit, how many millions of people are supposedly represented in Brussels? How valuable is any one person to this super state? And are their claims of better economic opportunity really convincing when one considers the success of small yet wealthy entities such as Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan with their opportunity and deregulation? Have we learned nothing from the inefficiency of the communist bloc, or from what Dr. Livingston reminded us was the historic achievement of the relatively peaceful devolution of the Soviet Union, into separate sovereign states after the Cold War? It will be interesting to see how England fares after Brexit. Will it be able to realize a nimble and dynamic economy that is able to take advantage of the release from the regulatory shackles of Brussels? Or will it once again be a lethargic economy as it was once in the post-war years as compared to the continent? If it thrives economically and its citizens prosper, then they will benefit from far greater property rights than those of the remaining citizens in the EU. One worries that the problem of the EU is that its member states have about as plausible an integration and as much in common as the constituent parts of the former Habsburg's Austro-Hungarian Empire. I think we know how that ended up. So what is the right size that fits the Goldilocks measurement of just right? Is it the states combining to the size of Althusius's Switzerland or Hume's Britain? Should it be the regional federation suggested for the United States? Should it be larger? Or does it sit somewhere with regard to the circumstances of the individual nation? Is it defended by water, as celebrated for England and the United States by Daniel Hannan? But what if George Kennan's assertion that the United States was already too large to govern? Given the devolution of Wales and Scotland, the decolonization, the dismantling of the empire, one has to wonder if the Confederation ideal is such a bad concept. It provides regions the identity, autonomy, with self-determination within a larger membership for protection. It's hard to defeat a mass of autonomous cells. Any expert on guerrilla warfare can tell us that. One has to wonder if the Catalans and Basques might accept such an arrangement in Spain, or how it might have worked in Quebec if they hadn't been frightened by all the imagery of economic dislocation. Who would fight harder than a free people, not a captive one? Baffa, Pialata, and Ponzetto said that there were 3 questions that must be answered. What regions are heterogeneous and what determines if they should be centralized or decentralized? How many levels of government should there be? How should boundaries be drawn? Now, multiple tiers of government, they said, would be problematic. Layers, like counties, should be removed. Rather than too large, they found that most of our states were too small and would reorganize them to about the same size. Their scheme calls for rejoining West Virginia and Virginia. They would mix regions to enhance the overall complexity of the voting public. They praised the European Union and sounded way too much to me like Woodrow Wilson at Versailles redrawing Europe, which of course was so successful we had the Second World War. I've decided that if I ever get the chance, I want to live in one of those so-called rotten boroughs in the UK that Daniel Hannon talked about in Chapter 3 in Inventing Freedom, where there are fewer voters for the MP. It's like their votes count so much more than everywhere else. Kind of like when you get a really good interest rate on your credit card with super rewards. I say that as someone from Massachusetts who was struck by something in the reading of Harmonizing Sentiments when I happened upon a reference to one of the lesser founding fathers. As my high school teacher, Mr. Babinski, taught us back in the day, one of our great claims to fame in the Bay State of Massachusetts is the innovation of gerrymandering, named after one Elbridge Gerry. If that name doesn't ring a bell, you can find him on pages 118 and 122. We knew him as Governor Gerry, who was famous for redistricting our districts into the shape of salamanders so that it would advantage his party. And thus you get gerrymandering. So with that, in the election of John F. Kennedy in 1960, our relationship with voting propriety is fairly well established. The push and pull of centralization is strong indeed. Per Pedersen Lidbaum did a study where Pedersen Lidbaum found it was larger the legislature, the smaller the size of the corresponding government. This would suggest that the best way to rein in the scope and bureaucracy of government would be to expand the number of representatives and senators. One could do this by further devolving large states. Neither of these two options seem particularly viable. Rather, the idea of creating smaller federations of states and empowering the states, or perhaps restoring the states to their sovereignty, would allow for the reversal of the overgrowth leviathan we now witness amongst us. If liberty from tyranny is truly our goal, smaller, decentralized, yet affiliated states are likely the best route to take, rather than giving in to the forces of centralization towards ever further dehumanization and devaluation of the individual. It is more respectful of property rights, and in a direct way, this allows for a better quality, a better standard of living for citizens, and the building of economic power and influence for the individual parts that rapidly become so much more valuable separately than as a single monolithic entity. I would say give me more devolution in local autonomy, more popular sovereignty, and free people will associate and collaborate far more as free people than they ever would under compulsory service and combination. Perhaps it is that very struggle versus centralization that is part of the reason for the continued success of small autonomous states and the aspirations of those states not yet liberated, that dynamic tension, that conflict with the binary opposition. I've enjoyed this class with all of you. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing all of you in the future.